The crack of a rifle split the frozen Wyoming dawn. Joe Morrison dove behind the barn door as splinters exploded inches from his head. His breath came in ragged clouds, heart hammering against his ribs. 29 years old, and this was how he'd die. Shot by his own hired hand over a woman nobody believed belonged here. "She's a fraud, Joe!" Thomas screamed from across the yard, chambering another round. "That woman's too old to be anybody's bride. You've been swindled." Joe's fingers dug into the snow-dusted wood. Mary Carter stood frozen in the ranch house doorway, her 59-year-old frame trembling, not with fear, but with something else, something that looked like recognition of violence she'd seen before. The Morrison Ranch sprawled across 300 acres of unforgiving Wyoming territory, 1878. 6 months of brutal winter had nearly destroyed everything Joe's father built. Cattle starving, wells frozen solid. And now this. His own men turning against him because he'd brought home a Christmas bride they called too old, too strange, too broken to save anything. Mary's voice cut through the chaos, steady as iron. "Joe Morrison, you get inside this house right now." Thomas fired again. The bullet punched through the barn wall behind Joe's head. If you've ever been called too old, too broken, too worthless to matter, this story is your proof that survival has no age limit. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because your witness keeps stories like Mary's alive. But Thomas wasn't done. He stepped into the open, rifle raised, and Mary Carter did something nobody expected. 6 weeks earlier, the stagecoach rattled into the small Wyoming town on Christmas Eve carrying cargo nobody wanted. Mary Carter stepped down onto frozen mud, her worn boots barely holding together. The driver wouldn't meet her eyes. "This the Morrison place?" she asked, her voice rough from 3 days without water. 2 miles north," he pointed with his whip. "But ma'am, you sure about this? Joe Morrison's advertisement said he needed a bride, but I'm too old," Mary finished for him. "I can read between lines just fine." She'd seen the newspaper listing in a St. Louis boarding house. "Widowed rancher seeks capable woman for marriage. Must be strong, resourceful, unbothered by hard work or harsh winters. Age matters less than character." The words had burned themselves into her memory, because nobody had ever called her capable before. Just used up. Just a burden. Joe Morrison waited at the ranch gate, hat in hand, looking younger than she'd imagined. His eyes widened when he saw her, but he didn't turn away. "Mary Carter." His voice cracked slightly. "That's right." She lifted her chin. "Your advertisement didn't mention an age limit." "Didn't figure one mattered." He extended his hand. "Welcome to Morrison Ranch, ma'am. Though I should warn you, things are worse than I wrote in those letters." Behind him, the ranch house sagged under snow. Fences leaned like broken teeth, and in the barn, something made a sound that wasn't quite human. Mary followed Joe through snow that came up to her knees. Her lungs burned in the thin December air, but she refused to show weakness. Not now, not ever again. "The well's frozen," Joe said, his words clipped with exhaustion. "Lost 12 head of cattle last week. Got 4 ranch hands left, but Thomas, he's been stirring trouble since I told them about you coming." "Because I'm old," Mary said flatly. Joe stopped walking, turned to face her full on. "Because you're a stranger. And because desperate men don't trust anything that feels like hope." He pushed open the barn door. The smell hit her first. Blood, fear, animal panic. In the back stall, a massive black stallion thrashed against iron chains, foam flecking its mouth. Its front leg hung at an unnatural angle. "Tried to jump the north fence 3 days ago," Joe said quietly. "Broke his leg clean through. He's my best breeding stock, worth more than everything else combined. But he won't let anyone near him. Been planning to shoot him tomorrow." Mary stepped forward slowly. The horse screamed, rearing against its restraints. "Don't," Joe warned. "He'll kill you." But Mary was already moving, her weathered hands reaching toward the animal's muzzle. Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow filled the barn. "Easy now. I know what it's like to hurt where nobody can see." The stallion's wild eye fixed on her. For one impossible moment, the thrashing stopped. Then Thomas burst through the barn door and everything shattered. "You brought a witch to this ranch!" Thomas spat, his hand hovering near the pistol on his hip. 2 other ranch hands flanked him, their faces hard with winter-born suspicion. Joe stepped between Mary and the men. "She's my wife. That makes her mistress of this ranch." "You haven't married her yet," Thomas shot back. "And you won't. Not when the whole town knows what she is." Mary felt the familiar weight settling over her shoulders, the burden of being too much and not enough all at once. 59 years of men telling her what she couldn't be, couldn't do, couldn't survive. "What am I exactly?" Her voice cut through the tension like a blade. Thomas sneered. "You tamed horses for the Donovan circus. Got kicked in the head and they threw you out. Now you're here pretending to be some mail-order bride when really you're just—" "Desperate," Mary finished. "Broken. Used up." She stepped forward and Thomas actually flinched. "I worked with horses my whole life. The Donovans didn't fire me because I got hurt. They fired me because I wouldn't let them keep animals in cages too small to lie down in. I reported them to the territorial marshal." Joe stared at her. "You can actually save that stallion?" "If you let me try." Outside, wind howled through the canyon like a living thing. The ranch house shutters banged against walls, and somewhere in the distance, a sound that made every man freeze, the unmistakable crack of ice giving way on the frozen creek that fed their entire water supply. The creek's death scream echoed across the canyon. Joe and his men sprinted toward the sound, boots sliding on frozen ground. Mary ran behind them, her older legs burning with effort. But she'd learned long ago that age was just another lie men told to keep women small. When they reached the embankment, Mary's heart sank. The massive ice dam that had blocked the creek for weeks had finally shattered. But instead of releasing a steady flow, the water was flooding out in a catastrophic surge, ripping away the banks, destroying the carefully built irrigation system Joe's father had constructed 40 years ago. "The lower pasture," Joe shouted. "If that water reaches the cattle—" He didn't finish. They all knew. 20 head of cattle stood in that pasture, too weak to move after months of scarce feed. The flood would drown them in minutes. Thomas turned on Joe, his face twisted with rage. "This is what happens when you bring bad luck onto a ranch. We should have sold out to the Hendersons months ago." But Mary was already moving down the embankment, her hands working at the rope coiled around her waist, the one she'd carried from her circus days. How long to reach that pasture on foot? 10 minutes, Joe said. Why? Because I can do it in 5. She pointed to a narrow ledge that ran along the canyon wall. If someone can get down there and redirect the flow using those fallen trees, that ledge won't hold a man's weight, Thomas said. Mary smiled grimly. Good thing I'm not a man. If you've ever been told you're too old to matter, too broken to be useful, this moment is for you. When Mary proves that survival has no expiration date. Tell us where you're watching from, because your voice reminds us why stories like this must be told. She was already climbing down when Joe grabbed her wrist. Mary, if you fall, I won't, she said. And then she was gone, moving across rock face like she'd done it all her life. But halfway across, the ledge beneath her feet began to crumble. Mary's boot slipped. Her fingers clawed at frozen rock, nails breaking, palms shredding. For one suspended heartbeat, she hung over a 30-foot drop into surging water that would crush her bones before she could drown. Then her other hand found purchase. She hauled herself up, chest heaving, and kept moving. Below, Joe and his men worked frantically to stack rocks and debris, trying to build a makeshift dam. But the water was too fast, too powerful. They were losing. Mary reached the cluster of fallen trees and assessed the situation with the cold calculation she'd learned in the circus. When animals' lives depended on understanding weight, leverage, and physics faster than most men could think. "Joe!" Her shout barely carried over the roar. "The rope's in the barn. How much weight can they hold?" 500 pounds, he called back. She nodded, began lashing the trees together with her rope, creating a massive barrier. Her 59-year-old shoulders screamed in protest, but she'd carried heavier loads. She'd survived harder trials. "Mary, the water's rising!" Thomas yelled, and for the first time his voice carried something other than contempt. It carried fear, for her. She wedged the final knot tight, then did something that made every man below go silent. She climbed onto the makeshift raft of logs and began pushing it toward the surging water. "What are you doing?" Joe's voice broke with panic. "Creating a dam," she shouted back. "But someone needs to guide it into position, and I'm the lightest." The logs hit the water. The current grabbed them like a fist. Mary held on, her body submerged to the waist in ice-cold water that stopped her heart for 3 beats. Then Joe was beside her, having jumped in without hesitation. Joe's arms locked around Mary's waist, his strength the only thing keeping her from being swept away. Together, they wrestled the logs into position, wedging them between 2 massive boulders. The water's fury battered them, but the makeshift dam held. "Now," Joe shouted, "get back to shore." But Mary saw what he couldn't. The rope lashing was starting to fray. In seconds, the whole structure would collapse and the flood would resume. "Someone needs to reinforce it," she gasped, her lips blue with cold. "Then I'll do it," Joe said. "You get to safety." "You can't reach the weak point." Mary's voice was steady despite her shaking body. "Your shoulders are too broad, but mine." She didn't wait for permission. Ducked under his arm and pulled herself hand over hand along the logs toward the failing rope. Her fingers were numb. She couldn't feel the knots, but she'd tied circus rigging in snowstorms before. This was just another performance where failure meant death. Behind her, Joe was screaming something. Thomas was shouting, but Mary focused on the rope, on the pattern her hands knew by memory, on the simple truth that she'd survived 59 years by refusing to quit. The knot pulled tight. The dam held. The water began to slow. Mary started back toward shore. That's when she saw Thomas on the embankment, rifle raised, aimed not at her, but at Joe. "I'm sorry, boss," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "Henderson's paying $5,000 for this land. Said if I could make sure you didn't survive the winter." The rifle's crack split the air. But Joe didn't fall. Thomas did. Mary stood on the log dam, her arms still extended from throwing the heavy iron stake she'd grabbed during her climb. It had struck Thomas's shoulder, spinning him around, sending his shot wild into the canyon wall. The rifle tumbled from his grip. He clutched his bleeding shoulder, staring at Mary with shock that mirrored everyone else's. "You could have killed me," Thomas whispered. "Could have," Mary agreed, pulling herself onto the shore. "Chose not to. Figured you'd been paid enough to betray your boss, but not enough to die for it." Joe reached her side, his hands frantically checking her for injury. "Mary, that throw. How did you—" "Circus performer, remember?" Her smile was grim. We didn't just tame horses. We did knife-throwing acts, high-wire performances, whatever kept audiences coming back. I spent 20 years hitting targets smaller than Thomas's shoulder from twice that distance. The other ranch hands had Thomas restrained now. Joe turned to them, his voice carrying the weight of authority his father had taught him. Take him to town. Let the marshal sort it out. And someone ride to the Henderson place. Tell them their hired saboteur failed. As the men led Thomas away, Joe faced Mary fully. His eyes held something she'd never seen directed at her before. Not just respect, but wonder. You saved my cattle, saved my ranch, probably saved my life. He took her frozen hands in his. Mary Carter, I don't care that you're 59 years old. I don't care what anyone in this territory thinks. I'm asking you properly now. Will you marry me? Mary opened her mouth to answer. That's when the second gunshot rang out, and Joe's eyes went wide with pain. Joe staggered. Blood bloomed across his shoulder. Thomas hadn't been disarmed after all. He'd had a backup pistol. No! Mary caught Joe as he fell, lowering him to the frozen ground. The bullet had gone clean through, missing anything vital, but he was losing blood fast. Thomas stood 20 feet away, the small derringer shaking in his good hand. Henderson's paying enough that I can disappear for what I done, but I can't leave witnesses. He raised the gun toward Mary. She didn't move. Just met his eyes with the same steady gaze she'd used to calm terrified horses, to face down circus masters who thought her too old to matter, to survive every man who'd ever told her she was worthless. Go ahead, she said quietly. But I've seen men like you my whole life, Thomas. Men who'd sell their souls for money they'll never spend because guilt eats them alive. You pull that trigger, and you'll never sleep again. I know, because I've watched it destroy better men than you. Thomas's hand wavered. You don't know what it's like. Being poor, being desperate. I know exactly what it's like, Mary said. I've been poor for 59 years, desperate for 58 of them, but I never once thought another person's suffering would ease mine. The derringer lowered slightly. In that moment of hesitation, one of the ranch hands tackled Thomas from behind, sending the gun skittering across ice. Mary turned her full attention to Joe, ripped strips from her skirt to bind his wound. Her hands worked with practiced efficiency, the same way they'd mended broken wings on circus birds, splintered shattered legs on horses nobody else could touch. Stay with me, she whispered. Joe Morrison, you stay with me. His eyes fluttered open. Mary, still waiting for your answer. She leaned close, her weathered face inches from his. Yes, you broken rancher. Yes, I'll marry you. He smiled. Then his eyes closed. And Mary Carter, 59 years old and done with being invisible, lifted Joe Morrison in her arms and carried him toward the ranch house, where the preacher was still waiting from Christmas Eve 3 hours ago. The preacher looked up startled as Mary kicked open the ranch house door, Joe cradled in her arms like he weighed nothing. Behind her, the remaining ranch hands stumbled in, blood-spattered and stunned. He needs doctoring, Mary said, lowering Joe onto the kitchen table. But first, he needs a wife. You going to marry us or not, preacher? The old minister blinked. Ma'am, the man's been shot. Which is exactly why we're not waiting. Mary's voice brooked no argument. You heard him propose. You heard me say yes. Now make it legal before God takes him from me. Joe's eyes opened. Mary's right. Do it now. So on Christmas Eve, 1878, in a Wyoming ranch house that smelled of blood and hope, a preacher married a 29-year-old widowed rancher to a 59-year-old woman the world had called too old to matter. "I do," Joe whispered, his voice weak but certain. "I do," Mary said, the words ringing like bells. The kiss they shared was gentle, reverent, and witnessed by men who'd learned that strength had nothing to do with age and everything to do with refusing to break. 6 months later, Mary Morrison stood in the same barn where she'd first calmed the black stallion. The horse was healed now, running strong in the pasture. The ranch was thriving. And Joe, her husband, her partner, her proof that love had no expiration date, wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Still think I'm too old," she murmured. "I think you're exactly what I needed," he replied. "Forever. If you've ever been called too old, too broken, or too used up to deserve love, this story is your reminder that new beginnings don't ask permission from calendars. Share it with someone who needs proof that hope has no age limit. Tell us where you're watching from, and let's keep reminding the world. She was too old to be a bride, until a broken rancher said, 'You're mine forever.' Your story matters, and it's never too late to write a new chapter.